Okay, hello everyone to our webinar series. My name is Raphael Ng, and I'm a member of a committee of junior HTCA scholars organizing this webinar series on multidimensional well-being. Together with Jacob Dirksen, we will be your moderators for this fifth session of our webinar series. And today we have the privilege of having Sarah White and Shreya Jha join us to discuss taking a relational approach to well-being, multidimensional well-being. So Sarah White and Shreya Jha are co-founders of Relational Wellbeing Collaborative, a relatively new venture bringing research on sustainable well-being strategies into consultancy work for systemic change. Perhaps our two speakers could share a little more about the Relational Wellbeing Collaborative and what you do with it. And prior to fully working on this venture, Sarah White was Professor of International Development and Wellbeing at the University of Bath. And she has 30 years of experience in research and consultancy on the social dimensions of global development. And Shreya Jha too brings over 20 years of experience of programmatic interventions and research on well-being on a range of topics, such as mental health, disability, gender, children's lives, and poverty, and disaster reconstruction. So together, Sarah and Shreya have been developing since 2009 the relational approach to well-being through research, primarily in India and in Zambia. So here are our speakers for today. We also have Kate Solis, Sebastian Osland, and Travis Chamberlain joining us, and they will be collecting your questions and seeding them to us moderators as we go along. We organized this webinar series with the intention of facilitating discussion. So please do write your questions on our Q&A, even as our speakers are presenting, so that we can group them and seed them together as a set of related topics. And please also use the chat function for comments. And if you like to upvote any questions, please, there's also an option to do so. And there are also other functions where you can exchange comments, maybe literature with each other as we go along. So as a matter of etiquette, please formulate your questions by opening, either if you're addressing it to one of our speakers, by opening and specifying which speaker you would like to address your questions to. And if you feel that you might have an extended inquiry that could build on responses and follow-up questions, we also have the option of enabling you to directly ask your questions to our speakers and to develop the discussion. If you would like to do so, please send the host, the HTCA host, or any of our panelists a message to let us know, and we will add you in the queue. So this session is recorded, but only the panelists are recorded. So of course, if you were to speak, to be one of the interlocutors, then your voice will naturally also be recorded. And the sequence of this webinar is pretty straightforward. It goes first into a 30-40 minute presentation by both Sarah and Shreya. And the rest of the time is then dedicated to questions and discussions. So please seed your questions generously, and our colleagues at the back office will pull them together and address them to both our speakers. So without further ado, here is Sarah White and Shreya Jha.
Welcome, everybody. So I'm Sarah. I'm going to start off the presentation, and then Shreya will take over partway through. And I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So the Relational Wellbeing Collaborative. So both of us have come from research backgrounds. So we're research-based because thinking matters. And I don't need to explain that to you all. We're also engaged in practice, and the move to the collaborative from the university is a move really to think about, well, how do we advance relational approaches to well-being in practice? How do we move out from the academy and into the so-called real world? And the essence of our approach is to link personal, societal, and ecological change. So this seminar, as I said, we're going to shift gears back to a more academic forum, which is exciting for us. We'll start off by explaining the thinking behind relational well-being. We'll then present the model of relational well-being, and we'll give a flavour of a practical application through the project that we are accompanying. So this is just one project amongst a number, but it's one that we think is particularly interesting to share with you. So the outline, I'll start off talking about thinking and how thinking matters and what our theoretical starting points are. And then as we go through the approach, we'll also talk about acting and relating. And our aim is to have a consistency across the thinking, the acting, and the relating. And before we start, just to have some apologies for referring to other papers. Obviously, we have little time here, so we have given you a number of references to our other work. So apologies if there's too much of that. So thinking matters. So well-being, as you're very aware, is everywhere. Everybody talks about well-being, but it's often very light on thinking. So a lot of it is about commerce, it's about making people feel good, you're worth it kind of approaches, or it can be very empiricist, very technical, about subjective well-being and discussions amongst statisticians about the best way to capture subjective well-being. Neither of those really is very reflective. There is also some work that is more critical about well-being and how well-being can enable us to think about what really matters in life. And the work that you may be familiar with, going beyond GDP, might come into that category. And also with COVID-19, there has been a lot of emphasis on the relational aspects of well-being. So becoming more aware of just how connected we are in ways that we seek and don't seek. So the incidental intimacies of touching handles of doors and so on, but also the importance of relationality, the importance of the hug, the importance of gathering together with people who matter to us. So I think there has been a real emphasis on the relational aspects of well-being through the COVID-19 crisis. I think our starting point in thinking about relational well-being is to say that no approach to well-being is innocent. So all of these approaches, whether or not they reflect on this, they do actually contain messages about who we are, what it is to be human, and about the world and how the world is and what it is to act in the world. And we've argued elsewhere that this ubiquity of well-being suggests actually that there's an anxiety about it, a cultural anxiety, that actually all is not well. And we have linked this to the decline of the social and relational in late capitalism and the increased emphasis that there is on individualism, on individual self-reliance, which for all sorts of reasons is valuable to our current economic model. If you want to know more about that, there's a paper in 2017, which you can have a look at. So to get a bit more academic in our terminology, in our view, discourses and practices of well-being are forms of technology of the self. So these shape how we think about ourselves and the world and about how change happens. So they involve ontology and they involve, so what is the nature of being, and epistemology. How can we know and what is there to be known? So there is a subjective aspect, and the reason that we've got this subjective, material and relational in yellow there is because these are key terms that we use in our approach. So first of all, there's the thinking, but then there's also the actual practice. So these are not simply about how we think about the world, but they make a difference to the world. They make a difference in terms of what kinds of products are produced, well-being products, what kinds of services go under the name of well-being, what kinds of policies go under the rubric of well-being. So it's not just about thinking, but it's also about acting in the world. And they then shape how we relate to each other and how we relate to the world. So they shape our ways of being. Are we more mindful? Are we less mindful? Do we think about our impact on other people? Do we think on whether we want to work in a collaborative way, or do we want to do participatory research? So they also have this relational aspect. So our view is that it's actually really important to be consistent in our thinking and our working and our relating across these different aspects of well-being. Again, we've reviewed other approaches in other publications. So what we're going to do here is really just concentrate on our own approach. What does it mean for us to take a relational approach to well-being? So what does a well-being approach need? So in terms of thinking, there's having a model. So how do we know if we've got well-being or not? We need to have some idea about what well-being means. And as others of your, as you've discussed in others of your seminars, the idea of well-being is very contested. People have very different ideas about what that means. So you need to have an idea of what it means if you're going to have a well-being approach. And I guess that's the most common form of a well-being approach. But what's important also, and this is less common, is to have some kind of a theory or a view on what promotes well-being. So what brings well-being about, what generates well-being, or what undermines well-being. So not just how do we know if we've got it, but if we want to advance it, then what kinds of processes do we need to be engaged with? And then, of course, there's the issue about concepts and methods. So, and these are very closely intertwined. So how do we think about well-being, but also how do we measure it then? Or how do we assess it? How do we track whether well-being is increasing or decreasing if we think in those kinds of terms? And the concepts and the methods are very closely intertwined. And again, it's something that has become very clear to us through doing research on well-being, just how important methods are. Methods embody the approach to well-being. So they actually make a great deal of difference in terms of thinking, even if that, again, is often not reflected on very deeply. And then there's the question of ontology and epistemology. So if we're taking a relational approach to well-being, then we need also to have a relational ontology. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So that's all the thinking, which is mainly what I'm going to talk about this morning, or at least it's morning where I am, maybe some other time of day where you are. And then there is acting. So here we have what's the vision? What is the direction of change that we're wanting to move in? What's the strategy? And how are we going to apply the approach? And relating. So thinking about the ways of being, ways of working. How do we work consistently in a relational approach? So what is well-being? In essence, well-being is about human subjectivity. It's a model of the human subject. It may not be very clearly thought out, but that is what a well-being approach expresses. So it may be quite a thin model of the subject, so an economic subject, which is just about choosing consumers, or maybe a psychological subject, which is about emphasizes the cognitive aspects of human life, but can often lack attention to the more material and relational dimensions, but particularly material. A principle for us is that our understanding of well-being should be as close as possible to the understanding of well-being of those people amongst whom we have been doing research or amongst whom we're working. So we want to take a person-centered approach and see people themselves as relational subjects. So this idea of relational subjects and the concept of relational well-being, it came out, as Raphael said, of our research, particularly in rural India and Zambia, 2010 to 14. There are a number of points here. First of all is that when you ask about well-being, people tend to talk about their relations with other people. So it's not just about an individual, but it's about having enough to care for the family, to share with others. So there's that sense of selves being essentially relational. Also, there is the understanding that it's relationships that make life meaningful. Why do we do things? Because of how it will affect the people that we care about, and that they enable people to get by and to get on. And this is particularly the case in contexts where the state is not strong or not very functional. People rely on their networks. They rely on their kin to support them. And also, of course, they get touched by their kin for support. So there's that two-way process, or many ways actually, not just two ways. And then the further point is that personal relationships and societal and ecological contexts critically structure the opportunities people face. So when we're thinking about relationality, we're not just thinking about personal relationships, but we're also thinking about relations between different aspects of life, between people and planet, between individuals and their social context, and how societal relations co-constitute individuals. So relationality in our approach does an awful lot of work. It means lots of different things. And of course, this whole understanding of relational selves or relational subjects isn't new. It's not specific to us. It's something that is very strongly there, particularly in social anthropology, but also in much of sociology. So to give you an example of what this means, this quotation, it comes from somebody who her husband had died through HIV/AIDS. So while he had been very ill, she had already taken over running the family and developing her own business. And this is how she described her situation, or one part of what she said. I think what gives more faith in myself is the way that I look at life, the way I do things especially. The most important thing is I value the life of my children, because I look at myself as one. If I don't do it, if I don't have faith in what I'm doing, I don't have faith in myself, how am I going to support my children? Because for now, although I'm a single woman, my children are happy. I'm able to find the few things that they need at school. So what we see in that is, it's not that there is no self. Her sense of self is very strong. It comes through here, but it is a relational realization of the self. So it's not like the kind of individualist versus collectivist society, that kind of frame at all. It is about a relational understanding of the self. So what do we mean by relational subjects? So first is to view people as subjects of their own life. And this may seem obvious, but actually in many development projects, people are not seen like that. They're seen as objects of our interventions. So that understanding that people are subjects of their own lives, but also then that they are subject to the social, political, economic, ecological, technological, and so on environment. So people are not sovereign individuals as subjects of their own lives, but they are subjects that are co-constituted in relation to one another and in relation to their environment. So this is reflected in observations. So in taking this example, we can see how the relationship with her children was central to her understanding of self. That's what gave her motivation. That's what drove her action. That's what kept her going against the odds. It's not within this peace particularly, but she talks in other parts of her interviews about the way that her brothers let her down. She looked to them for support and they didn't come through for her. So she is very clearly aware of her own responsibility and her own agency. If I don't do it, nobody will do it. If I don't look after my children, nobody will. And there is a sadness in that, a sense that other people should be helping her, but also a strength and a confidence that I'm going to do it and I am doing it. And also, of course, there's that awareness of being a single woman, and women who were heading households on their own in our research were having a harder time in all sorts of ways, materially, relationally, and they came out as lower in terms of subjective scoring of their own lives also. So there's that social vulnerability that she needs to navigate, an awareness of herself within that particular social context. So those are what you can just observe at the level of what she says, but then there's also a deeper level of analysis. And that tells us that personal and social relations co-constitute the self. It also draws attention to there are relations across different aspects of life. So the fact that her brothers didn't help out meant that she was more responsible. The fact that she had got these family responsibilities drove her in a particular direction in terms of her business development. So it's not that there are separate aspects of life, but that rather there is a commingling between aspects of life. What happens in one area has an effect in another. And of course, it takes us back, and both Shreya and I are sociologists, you won't be surprised to hear. So it takes us back to thinking about social structures and relations, including such issues as gender, the organization of the economy, race and ethnicity. These co-constitute the person. You don't have an individual and these things are separate, but that individual is the outcome of the interrelations of all these different factors. So as I mentioned earlier, a key part of our kind of modeling of well-being is thinking about dimensions of well-being and thinking about material, relational, and subjective dimensions. And these dimensions don't originate from our research, but from earlier research that I was involved in, which was the Wellbeing in Developing Countries research at the University of Bath. So that was 2002 to 2007. And within that research, this framing of relational, material, and subjective dimensions of well-being was originated. So what you can see here is I've kind of translated that earlier piece of text that I shared with you into relational, material, and subjective dimensions. And if you're thinking just in a short, kind of quick way of understanding what do these dimensions relate to, if we're thinking about relational, it's about being connected, and particularly being connected on fair terms. So it's also about the terms of exchange that people are engaged in. Subjective is obviously about feeling good. And material is about having enough. So you can see how in the way that it's written, there's this interrelation between these different aspects, these different dimensions of well-being. They're not separate from one another. They're very much interrelated, but still analytically, it's helpful to separate them out. So when we're talking about dimensions, we quite consciously talk about dimensions and we don't talk about domains. So many multidimensional models of well-being are based on domains. And this is one of them, the Wheel of Well-being. It's one that's quite common in the UK. Different ones there are many different domain models of well-being out there. What they're valuable for is in drawing attention to the fact that well-being is complex. There are many different dimensions of it. And their value then is that they appear to simplify that complexity. So they separate out into domains and then say, well, you can measure this domain. You can measure physical well-being separately from mental well-being, separate from connecting with people in this model. Now, the bases of these models are very variable. So some of them are based on theory. So, for example, Riff's psychological well-being is based on humanistic theories in psychology. This particular one is based on empirical research into mental health in the UK. They may be based on statistics and generated through factor analysis. Or they may simply be a group of people getting together and thinking, well, this seems to make sense. Let's put this here. So they're very variable in their bases. We've actually tried to generate a domain model of well-being, and we did generate a domain model of well-being, but it's actually really difficult to apply in practice. So there's it appears to be simple and to help, but actually it's quite difficult. And what's difficult is identifying the boundaries. What are the boundaries between well-being? How do you classify a particular aspect of life? So, for example, if you're thinking about this approach, if I give something to my friend, does that come under spirit give? Does that come under people connection? Where does it belong? Does it belong in both? So there are always those boundary problems, and those boundary problems are inherent to domain models because they're artificial, because life isn't lived in domains. So you're always going to have that problem. It's not just a technical difficulty, but it's actually a kind of ontological difficulty with such domain models. The other problem with many models of domain models of well-being is that they emphasize the model, but they don't have that sort of theory about the process through which well-being is achieved. So for all of these reasons, we keep away from domains. So when we talk about dimensions, as I've already said, they're essentially intertwined. This reflects experience. So this comes back to the point that I said earlier, that for us, it's really important that as far as possible, our understanding of well-being matches that of the people amongst whom we have been living and working. It avoids the need to discipline research subjects. So one of the things that was really uncomfortable for us in trying to operationalize a domain-based model of well-being was needing to get people to represent their own experience within the categories that we were imposing on them. And Shreya may want to talk more about that. I'll leave it at that, and maybe you can come back to questions if you like. Talking about the intersections between these different aspects of life helps us to see that there is interaction, and a relational approach emphasizes that change happens through the interaction of different elements. Change doesn't happen through one factor that goes along in a linear way, but it is the confluence of factors that produce change. In a programmatic context, this helps to alert us to unexpected outcomes and spillover effects. And it enables us to think about both process and state. So well-being is, hopefully, a state that we can experience, but it is a state that is constantly in process. And for this, it's really helpful, I think, the way that Fritjof Capra describes systems. He says systems forms are not rigid structures, but are flexible yet stable manifestations of underlying processes. And he's drawing on biological organismistic, careful how you say that one, models when he's talking about this. So what promotes well-being? Two more quotes for you. Quotes that always bring a bit of a throb in my throat when the comparison between the two. So the first was a very well-established Irish farmer in Chiawa. And this was after we had presented to him our briefing paper that came out of the research. He'd been reading it. We wanted to see if he thought, he was one of many people that we gave it to, what he thought of it, whether he thought it captured the situation well or not. So he said, I've been thinking about what happiness is since reading your paper. Not that we talked about happiness, but still. And I know what it is. It's freedom. Freedom that if you want to do something, you can go and do it. Freedom from the bank, freedom from the employers, freedom from the government. And I've got that. And then the other person, so from the same area, but he was a Zambian, and he was a village elder, and he was a farmer, a very innovative farmer, who had come to the area when he was grown up. He had cleared the land himself, and he had set up his own small holding. So he was taking us around the plot, showing us where he lived. So he said at the end, this is the land that I cleared. These are the mango trees I planted. This is the ground where I grow my vegetables. This is the land that will be taken from me one day. So when we're talking about what promotes well-being, the terminology that we use is well-being drivers. And we see these drivers at the personal level, at the environmental level, and at the societal level. So if we think about the environmental first in this case, both men are farmers. Both men depend on the vagaries of climate. And in that area, there are quite frequent droughts and also flooding. Both have introduced forms of irrigation to mitigate these. But the Irish farmer has got much higher technology farming methods at his disposal. So he's able to manage the environmental challenges rather more easily than the Zambian elder is. To personal level, both men are entrepreneurs, both are innovators, both are very hardworking, community-minded, honest, and fair. The societal is where we really see the difference between them. So they both experience advantages due to their gender and age, they're elder men, but they differ by wealth and ethnicity. And critically, there are many dimensions of this, of course, but critically, Zambian law and local politics enabled the Irish farmer to buy his land. And of course, it's a much larger area than what the Zambia elder was able to occupy. So he has the title to the land, whereas the Zambian elder, although he has repeatedly tried to get title, cannot get it. And it's an area in which land is being expropriated all the time. So he's in real danger of having basically the land sold out from underneath him. So when we're thinking about well-being, yes, of course, it's about how people are in themselves, how they're thinking about their life, what they can think, what they can be and do, how they think and feel. But we cannot forget the context which either enables or undermines well-being. So we need to think about what are the drivers of well-being and how, again, in the interrelationship of these is well-being promoted or undermined. So the relational ontology, I realize I'm talking too much. As I said already, it's not just about thinking about personal relationships, but it's about thinking about the underlying ontology. So all approaches to well-being recognize the importance of relationships. Subjective well-being talks about how married people generally report higher subjective well-being scores than single people do. Self-determination theory, a eudaimonic approach to well-being, talks about relatedness of one of 3 essential psychological needs. In the capability approach, Drez and Sen talk about how the options that a person has depend on relations with others and on the state and other institutions. So there's nothing surprising about recognizing the importance of relationality to well-being. But in all of those cases, the underlying ontology remains individualist. So relationships are exterior to people. They're like social determinants which affect people, but are not essentially constitutive of people in the way we understand them to be. So relational well-being looks beyond individual psychology and beyond individual behaviour to the underlying processes that promote healthy environments and happy lives. So as Sarah Atkinson has said, this directs attention to social, material, and spatially situated relationships. through which individual and collective well-being are affected. So as I've already said, we see people as relational subjects, and we see the character of different elements emerges through their relations with each other, rather than inhering essentially within themselves. So it's that relationality, even of different elements, that makes us understand what they are and makes them what they are. So change then in a relational ontology is powered by interaction. Shreya, over to you.
Thanks. So if you put all of that together, everything that Sarah's been talking about in the last some time, that's the relational well-being approach, or a relational approach to well-being. And putting it together generates a model like this, where you have the well-being dimensions right in the center. And the dimensions are the material, relational, and the subjective. And underlying those dimensions are the drivers. So the drivers of well-being, which are the personal, societal, and environmental. And if you see in the bottom corner, along the edge of the environmental drivers, it says again, material, relational, and subjective. So within each of these drivers, there will be material, relational, and subjective dimensions. And that's something that we'll talk about as we go on further in this presentation. And running through all of this is the relational approach. That involves relational thinking, relational working, and conceiving of people as relational subjects. So Sarah's talked quite a lot about what we mean by relational subjects. And I'll talk a little further about what we mean by relational thinking and relational working. And I'll talk about that in the context of what it means to apply a relational approach to well-being. So the example that I'm going to talk about is a program called Yoma. And Yoma is, so this is part of a recent engagement of ours, our work through the collaborative. It's a digital platform for young people in Africa. And it's been conceptualized as a response to youth unemployment, to lack of appropriate and relevant skills amongst young people that would help them gain employment or livelihoods, and most importantly, the lack of or uneven access to opportunities. That's something that's quite important in the Yoma, in the thinking behind developing this program and this platform. So the aims are to enable access to training, to mentoring for young people, and to livelihood opportunities. And how the program goes about doing this is by encouraging young people to solve problems. Very often these are issues in local communities. Those serve as a process for young people to learn skills. They're also linked to social impact. So for instance, young people might be encouraged to get involved in immunization drives and facilitate that for a local community. And they might learn skills of collaboration, management, organizing, that kind of thing. And it does something for a community that they might be a part of. And through this process, they earn some credit in the form of digital tokens. This is a digital platform. And what those tokens do is allow them to the young people can then redeem those tokens against training or requests for mentorship or goods, actually. So those tokens are valid on something like 2,000 marketplaces or something, and they can actually use them to buy goods or services that they need. And what this all does is the activities and the training that young people are involved in sort of build up for them a CV on the platform. And because the platform has so many stakeholders, the platform itself therefore validates that CV. And the reason why it was thought that this was important was that it would allow young people to show that actually they had undergone the training that they claim to have done. So it generates reliability, it helps them win trust, it leads to appropriate matching for the kinds of opportunities that young people might need. It matches that to what might be actually available, links them with mentors, both in the private and the public sector. And crucially, it aims to overcome the lack of connection, and the connection is so often necessary to access opportunity. So that's what Yoma is about. And what we're doing in Yoma is, well, I'll talk about that. We're taking a relational approach to sort of thinking about how this program can develop. Can we go to the next slide? So what does it mean to take a relational approach? What does relational thinking mean? What does relational working mean? So relational thinking is about emphasizing, thinking about the flow, conjunctions, and emergence. In the context of Yoma, what we would want that to achieve is that it extends and enhances connections that are at the heart of Yoma vision. And it should do that in ways that recognize the structural disadvantage that many young people face, and instead promote social inclusion. Relational working in this context would be that the young people, young Africans who should benefit from this program, and the placement providers can actively collaborate in the design, learning, and reshaping of Yoma. And as relational subjects, what we would want is that Yoma should, even as it ensures that placement opportunities are available for young Africans, it should do so on terms that take into account their responsibilities as relational subjects. So for example, the need to care for their families, to be able to have enough income to share with others. And as an example of how a relational approach might be working in practice is the manner in which the platform is being developed. So quite recently, the program management has been talking to young people, asking them what might be important for them to see in the platform. And they've talked about, say, for instance, something like fairness. They want a sense of community. And then at the back end, developing this application, the Yoma team is thinking about, well, if young people want fairness, how is that a value that we can actually have in the application on the platform? What feature can be available on the platform that actually promotes that? So that's a process that's still underway, and I can't tell you right now what that feature is, and hopefully it'll be something that we can see in about a month's time or a couple of months' time. Yeah. So in terms of well-being outcomes, so this comes to the material, relational, and subjective dimensions of well-being. What would we want to see as a result of this program? In material terms, we want to see that young people are able to progress in their careers as a result of the skills and the experience which they have gained. In relational terms, we should be able to see that young people are able to build, extend, and deepen their social networks and their ability to navigate within them. And in subjective terms, they should have the confidence, they gain in confidence and self-belief. And in order to measure this, so this is, of course, so we've thought about measurement in quite a few different ways. We've thought about both quantitative and qualitative, and subjective and objective measures. So the way that you might want to measure in this program is you'd want to measure before the program. So in development practice terms, at baseline, you want to measure periodically during the program, and you want to measure at some point after the program or as cohorts move through the Yoma program. And the aim of that should be that you're looking to analyze and correct the programming as you go along. And as I said already, the measures would be both quantitative and qualitative. So what you want from the qualitative is meaning. What does it mean to the young people or other stakeholders in this program? So a measure of the material dimension of well-being, a subjective measure might be young people's satisfaction with career progression. An objective measure, an example, is that they have increased income. That's only one of possibly many other objective measures. Measures of the relational dimension of well-being, a subjective measure would be, do you know the people who can help you make your way in life? This goes back, of course, to what we've talked about, that very often relationships are the medium through which you gain opportunities, and they're really important. And what might be an objective measure of that might be access to various channels of information that you're part of. So, are you part of a group that gets a regular messages about here are opportunities that you can go, to seek, for instance. And the subjective dimension of well-being, again, you can have both subjective and objective measures. So a subjective measure, for instance, would be the level of confidence that young people have. And an objective measure might be, that it's useful to contact somebody. How often are you actually able to make that approach to contact that person whom you think might enable you to gain access to something? So those are both subjective and objective measures. And we'd also want sort of qualitative information both about the process itself. So what is young people's perception of going through the Yoma program? Or what's their perception of the training? What's their perception of how well the platform works for them? But we would also want to know we want to understand the interrelations between the dimensions of well-being. So as we've said earlier, they're co-constitutive. How is it that young people perceive those interrelations between the different dimensions? So Sarah talked earlier about the well-being drivers. And here just to think about the well-being drivers in a little bit more detail. So the personal drivers are those that generate variability at the individual level. And they might include things like temperament, personal histories of individual dynamics within the selves, and direct interactions both with others, but also with the immediate context and the kinds of effects that this has on individuals. The societal driver is about variability between social groups. So this would comprise of factors such as the organization of the economy, social difference, inequality, policy and politics in that context, technology, social norms and culture, and how all of these might be constituting difference at the societal level. And at the environmental level, the environmental driver is about understanding variability based on the environment which sustains human well-being. And we're talking here both about the natural environment as well as the built environment. So factors such as space and place, built environment, but also climate, biodiversity, pollution, and ecological sustainability. So what might we want to see as a shift in the well-being drivers? And also important to recognize that the shifts that we want to see in well-being drivers are what could be thought of as an impact of the program. So as you see in this matrix, you have the drivers running along the top, and the dimensions within each of the drivers running along the side. So for instance, the personal material would be the young people are able to act, to gain information, develop skills that enable them to progress in their careers. The relational would be young people join and help foster more equitable social networks. And the subjective would be that they feel empowered to develop themselves further. The societal driver, again, you have a material, relational, and subjective. Material might be that there's more effective matching of companies with placements to offer the candidates seeking to develop their skills. The relational is about equitable distribution of opportunities to build transferable skills and gain work experience. And the subjective, the societal subjective driver would be that there is increased awareness of the importance of fairness and transparency in the allocation of placement of opportunities. And similarly, in the environmental, there's material, relational, and subjective. The material is about reducing levels of waste, carbon emissions, other forms of environmental damage. The relational is that environmental impacts resulting from the Yoma initiatives, and there's a pathway in that called Green Yoma, specifically about the environment and working on climate change issues. That those should be experienced in less advantaged communities, not only more advantaged. So that's how the gains are distributed. And finally, about the environmental subjective is that environmental consciousness is actually raised through engagement in Yoma. And we'll just give you an example of how the drivers might be assessed. We won't go through all of them. But it's important also to note over here that for the societal and environmental drivers, there would be largely objective measures and largely at the collective level. For the personal drivers, they might remain individual indicators, individual level indicators. So a material objective indicator might be, for example, increased number of candidates with appropriate qualifications. And the subjective would be from the point of view of, say, companies that are hiring young people, satisfaction with the young people whom they've recruited, the interns or employees whom they've recruited. The relational objective would be that more interns from less advantaged backgrounds get employed. And the relational subjective should be that there is actually a perception of equity in the distribution of opportunities. And finally, the subjective, an objective indicator of the subjective is that there are actually transparent processes for company internships. So for instance, a company might say that they are an equal opportunity employer and put out in the public domain what that means for their recruitment process. So that's a transparent process. And subjectively, is there actually a perception of openness in the allocation of internships? And of course, this is, you might be drawing this data both from young people themselves, but also from the companies, right, who are on this platform too. So what a relational well-being approach does is that it offers a frame for analyzing situations, for analyzing the context, excuse me. But it also provides a vision on the basis of which to develop well-being strategies. So one of the motivations for adopting a well-being approach is that it brings unity or strategic alignment to what might be a very diverse portfolio of work. Often this unity or alignment is brought about through a domain model or via subjective well-being, so sort of global measures of well-being or happiness, for instance. But with relational well-being, the convergence is seen both in the outcomes, as we showed you in a previous slide, as well as in the impact on the well-being drivers. And if you notice, both the well-being outcomes and the well-being drivers both sort of you can see how they link up with each other. So finally, to reiterate, the relational approach to well-being links personal, societal, and ecological change. And it holds that personal and interpersonal well-being are grounded in social justice and ecological sustainability. So as you see from the image on the side, that's the vision of well-being. But what it does is also combine, think of, and try to operationalize well-being as a state that is the interlinked material, relational, and subjective dimension. So in application, the outcomes, the processes that promote well-being. So those are the interlinked personal, societal, and ecological drivers, and a relational ontology, most importantly. So relational thinking and working, but also conceiving of people as relational subjects. Thank you. And there are references.
So thank you, Sri, and thank you, Sarah, for your wonderful presentation. So as a way to start, perhaps we could first address some questions relating to the definition of what relational means. So Rika Goswami asks if it's correct to say that the word relational is also being used in two different ways. And another anonymous attendee also asked, and here I would read out the question, which is a little extended, a little long. What is the role of the first and second person or personal in the concept of relations? The reason that this person asks is that at times it seems that relations require that those involved are interpersonally involved in them. But at other times, it seems that relations are merely third personal. For example, descriptions of how two beings relate without it being essential to the relation that the beings are personally involved in them as such. So this person gives an example, for instance, the relation between two people based on their class need not be seen by them in their relationship with one another. And when we speak of relational well-being, are we speaking of well-being predicated off of interpersonal relationships or off of all ways of relating two beings to each other through sociological categories? So it's a long question. So maybe you could help us with what you view are some of the distinctions within the term relation and relational. And that would also maybe help us move forward with other questions that tie together with the term relational.
Sure, let me have a go at this one. So yes, as I said, the relational, the term, does do a lot of work in our approach. So on the one hand, yes, it's about the interrelations between things that do actually come into contact. So it is about personal relationships and social relationships. And in that context, we are talking about, yes, interpersonal interaction. So we're not talking about two people as having a relationship, which is a theoretical relationship as members of a class. We're talking about, your relationship between yourself and your employer or whatever. But the other aspect of the relationship is seeing how people are constituted relationally in relation to social structures and processes. So the relationship is not between two people who happen to be members of the same class, but rather saying that in both cases, in all cases, but in those cases, they are similarly affected because of their positioning in respect to class structures and processes. So it's about that, the relationship with those underlying societal structures and processes that we're concerned with there, rather than a theoretical relationship because they are members of the same class. So that relationship between through underlying structural processes will give them that relation as members of the same class, but that is not the relationship that we're particularly interested in, if that makes sense, unless they come to act together as a result of that, in which case obviously then it becomes more interesting. Does that make sense?
Shreya, do you also have something to add?
No, not right now.
Okay, so I just would like to also follow up with a question that Sarah, when you described the relational realization of the self, and you use such words as it being constitutive for a person's identity and their sense of well-being. So here I see that this dynamic of relational also has on the one hand an empowering constitutive factor, but on the other hand, it's also a kind of vicarious identification of well-being through other people. So the example that you gave is my children are happy, and it seems then that this well-being is subject to someone else's determination. So is this a problem for what you see as relational well-being? If say, for example, a person within a household has responsibilities to care for the children, and maybe in certain conditions that might become an issue of adaptive preference or subtle forms of oppression, or I guess, well, maybe oppression might be a strong word, but subtle forms of pushing someone to do, nudging someone to do something, and to identify with the well-being of someone else.
Sorry, I just need to plug in. So I think in our view, relationships are not either good or bad, they simply are. I mean, it just is a fact that we are relationally constituted. And you think about attachment theory and many other theories which show that it's just critical to human being that they emerge through, we all emerge through our relations with one another. So it's neither good or bad, it just is the way it is. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I think I'm probably missed part of your question. Shreya, can you help me out on that one?
I would say that I think I'd go back to one of the points that we had in the presentation, that we do see people as relationally constituted. So it's not possible to think of, or at least in our view, the relationship is not external to the person. So you use the term vicarious, vicarious realization of well-being. I think that's the way you phrased it. But I think I would say that it's not vicarious. It's as important for the person that others with whom they are in relation are also doing well. So if people constantly, so in our research that we talked about, people constantly said that it's not enough for me to have, for instance, rice for myself. It's not just for my family. I should be able to share with others as well, because I am part of this community, and it isn't just that I'm a member of this community. It is very much that that relationship is not something that, again, to reiterate, not exterior to the person. I don't know if that answers your query.
So okay, I believe Jacob also has more questions, and maybe we could unfold these ideas as we go along?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Sarah and Shreya, for such a comprehensive and clear presentation. Certainly lots of food for thought for all of us. I'm just going to ask a question that Suzanne has put into the Q&A box, and that other attendees thought was an interesting question to ask. It has been upvoted quite a few times. So Suzanne asks, what role do you feel international human rights frameworks can or should play in promoting and supporting a relational form of well-being? In particular, in the context of well-being drivers that you present as personal, societal, and environmental, and the example that you give of two farmers where one is disadvantaged and not advantaged by the law.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that we've actually been giving some thought to in recent months, partly through our engagement with other projects and a philanthropy with which we are working. I guess the short answer would be that we see them as complementary. As I understand it, rights sort of accrue to individuals or to categories, and don't, I'm going out on a limb here, I may be wrong about this, and don't necessarily attend to the relational. And that's something that we do in our relational well-being approach. But more importantly, I think rights in the form of entitlements are certainly very important as, you know, as a context or as an enabling environment in which well-being might be realized, or in which people might be able to have a sense of well-being. So rights as an enabling environment, you know, the lack of entitlements can be a constraint to be able, you know, to achieve well-being or to have a sense of well-being. So in that sense, I would say that there are almost like a necessary condition, especially if you think about rights as entitlements. They may not be a sufficient condition, and I would say that they're a necessary condition to have a sense of well-being, in that they ensure sort of that certain basics are there. So especially in, you know, the material, but also, all of, also in sort of societal terms, in terms of societal drivers, environmental drivers. So I would say that they're complementary.
Thanks, Shreya. Just as I was posing Suzanne's question, there was actually a clarification on that question. So I'll just quickly read that out as well, and then we'll see if either you, Shreya, or Sarah have any additional comments or clarifications. So Susan also writes, to clarify my question about human rights and ensuring well-being, I'm asking about human rights offering a legal and politically accountability mechanism by addressing vertical relations, which is not evident in your dimensions and which seem more focused on horizontal relations. Is there anything that you would want to further comment on, adding to the answer you already gave, Shreya?
I think I'd want to say that we aren't only concerned about horizontal relations, we're very much concerned about vertical relations as well. So relations between employer and employee, relations between government and people, those are very much part of what we are concerned about as well. That didn't come across within the presentation, but it is what we're also concerned about.
Yes, and when we talk about the relational, we're also talking, as this is something that we said earlier, it's also about shifting the terms of engagement. So it isn't just about having relationships, but having more equal relationships or fairer terms of engagement. So I think that does take into account vertical relations as well.
But yes, to reiterate, you know, there is no well-being without human rights, but there can be rights without well-being. So that's why we said social justice, we would see human rights as a part of that, as one of the critical drivers of personal and interpersonal well-being.
Thank you. So we also have attendees who would like to ask you some questions. So we now have Clementia Eugene, and she would like to ask you the questions directly. Clementia, could you post your questions then to our speakers, please?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. In your conceptualization of well-being, you identified 3 drivers. These are personal, environmental, and social. So I'm thinking, in the spirit of the human capability approach, these are considered conversion factors. So my question is, in identifying the drivers, which are equivalent to the 3 main conversion factors, was that deliberate? And if so, how so? Or was it consequential? And if they were consequential, how so?
Not quite sure that I understand your question. It wasn't deliberate in the sense of deliberately relating it to the capability approach, but I suspect you don't mean that. You mean something different to that.
No, so I am busy doing my research on child maltreatment, and I am using the same, focusing on conversion factors. What are the issues that are relevant in terms of protecting children? And I have used the conversion factors as part of my theoretical framework. But here you are using it as well-being. You have the same 3 conversion factors that are known to the capability approach: personal, environmental, and social. So I was just, and nowhere did you mention them within the context of the conversion factors. So I was just wondering whether they were deliberate so as to keep within the doctrine, let's want to a better word, of the capability approach, or was it consequential? And I'm curious if it was consequential so as to use your context, your ideas within my own research. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, it came out of our research, so it wasn't anything to do with the capability approach. We're not capability approach scholars, so we're that isn't our tradition at all. So it came out of reflecting on what people had said. So reflecting on the kinds of texts that we have shared little bits of with you today, and the situations that people seem to find themselves within, and our kind of analysis of that. So it was based on our research, observations, and analysis rather than drawn from another framework.
Thank you. So that explains it to me. Thanks. Great.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
I'd next like to ask a question that Mari has put in the chat. And Mari says, "Hi everyone, and thanks for the presentation. My question is, the relational approach is not already embedded in the concept of social capital, ? So I guess the question is, isn't the concept already fully developed as the concept of social capital?"
Okay. So the social capital does not use a relational ontology. So it does obviously talk about some relational goods, if you like, some things like trust and networks and so on. So there are some overlaps with social capital, but the great problem with there are many great problems with it as a concept, but one of the problems is that it appears to bound something as social capital. And that is precisely what we're trying not to do. We're trying not to bound things, but rather to explore the interrelations between different things. So yes, there are some aspects of work on social capital that are, close to what we would want to be talking about, but the overall theorization within which social capital takes a place is very different from our relational approach.
Okay, so we have another of our attendees who would like to ask a question directly. Her name is Jessica Fernandez, Jessica, could you please unmute yourself and post your questions?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this great presentation. My name is Jessica, and I'm from Honduras in Latin America. And I'm working with Afro-Indigenous peoples in Central America. So my question is, what about the spirituality in this, to include in this relational well-being approach? I think it's very important for many indigenous and African communities, this relational and this issue about the spirituality in all the relations between the people and with the environment. So this is my question. I don't know if it's clear, but
Yes, absolutely. Shreya, we'd like to take that first, and I'll come in if
Yeah,
you...
sure. And yeah, so this is, I'll have to give you a little bit of the backstory of how we came to the relational well-being approach. So in the research that we talked about, research that we did in India and Zambia, and as Sarah said earlier, we did originally have a domain-based model. We developed a domain-based survey, which was to measure inner well-being. And we did have a domain that asked questions about values, which included, questions about people's spirituality and how they worshipped, whether they felt that, they could worship as they pleased, and issues related to that. And we recognize very much the importance of spirituality and people's sense of values to their well-being. But as we developed the relational well-being approach and thought more in terms of practice, and because we moved from a domain-based model to a relational ontology where we see the material, relational and subjective as co-constitutive, we no longer specifically talk about the spiritual. But if we had to, or if people talked about their spirituality, we'd be able to assess or understand it in subjective terms. We would be able to understand it, in terms of their subjective well-being. We would be able to understand it in terms of their relational well-being. So it's not that it's not there, but it's not there coded as spirituality or labeled as spirituality. If that answers your question. Sarah, do you want to add something?
Yes, I mean, I would say, it was very clear. It was very clear in a number of different ways. It was very clear in terms of people felt themselves to be in relation to God. I mean, and people often spoke about their relationship with God, and that was one of the key relationships actually that was important in terms of giving meaning again. So I would say it's very much there within the relationality, and people had different kinds of discourses that they use, different kinds of discourses. So one was a kind of high discourse, if you like, about, this is particularly, I'm thinking about Zambia, about a Christian worldview, which they related themselves to. But there was also another discourse which was about kind of witchcraft and different kinds of powers that they were having to negotiate. So they talked differently at different times about these. So yes, absolutely, spirituality. I mean, to label it as spirituality itself is, I think, problematic, because that's part of a kind of modernist worldview which separates off the spiritual from the material and so on. Whereas actually, I think if you look at people's relationships with God, they were material, they were subjective, they were relational. It was all together. So we wouldn't want to separate off spirituality as a separate domain, but we would definitely understand, and take into account people's sense of their relationship with God or with other spiritual powers, or other powers, whether they label them as spiritual or not, ancestors and so on. Different kinds of powers that people are negotiating is very much part of the lives that people live. Absolutely. And the other aspect of it that was very important was, as you mentioned, that sense of the interrelatedness of life. So in Zambia, people had historically had, when there was harvest, they had made oblations to the spirits. So there was that very strong sense of the people as a collective and their relationship to the land and their relationship to the gods or the spirits, as one, and again as interrelated. And it was very much there within the Indian context, which was with an indigenous group within the Indian context that we were working. So I remember somebody talking about, if we don't tend the garden, the creator will not send the rain. So that sense again of a collective interrelationship between the land, the people, and the gods. So yes, you're absolutely right. We didn't mention it, and it's a really important part of many people's experience of themselves and their lives.
Thank you very much for the answers.
Great. I think next we have another participant from the audience, Gwendoline, who has a question and would ask to like to ask it themselves. So Gwendoline, please go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Sarah and Shreya, for a very comprehensive presentation. I'm from a different background. I come from the health promotion sector, and we also think a lot about well-being and health related to well-being and quality of life. And I was wondering how your theory relates to the social practice theory and the dimensions that Elizabeth Shaw uses, meaning and material and competencies to understand how a social practice influences people's relationships and how they can work towards their own quality of life and well-being. Do you relate to that theory, or do you?
I don't actually know that theory. So
okay,
that's something for us to look up. What was the name again? So it's social practice theory and the person?
Elizabeth Shaw. Shove.
Okay, that's one for us to look up. It sounds like it would have a lot of similarities, but yeah, ignorant, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you for trying. It could be interesting to look into how they relate to each other, because I think there is a lot of overlap and maybe they can mutually reinforce each other.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. We'll look into that.
Okay, so we have another question by Tatiana Bruni, and here she writes, in the project you presented, you showed us possible instruments for measuring the impact of the program. What types of actions across the different dimensions have you implemented or think to implement to address situations when the expected well-being is not achieved? So this is Tatiana Bruni's question.
Go ahead, Shreya.
Right, that's it's quite a complicated question, and there are no easy answers. So our engagement with this program is quite new. We've sort of been working with them for about the last previous 3 months or so, and the program itself is obviously also under development. So one of the things we talked about when we said that, about the assessing well-being outcomes and the drivers, but the outcomes in particular, and we said that one would be about the periodicity of assessing those kinds of outcomes, and the aim of that is also to be able to actually understand whether well-being is, whether young people are actually experiencing well-being or not. And if they are not, which is very much possible, how do you course correct? And I think that course correction has to come from understanding the context. So I'm not sure that I can give you a sort of a prescription that this is the thing to do that will ensure that young people experience well-being. That the what has to be done will come from the actual assessment and understanding to be able to recognize what the gap is that has not been addressed. Does that make sense? And I was going to say something else. Sorry, I've lost my second thought. Sarah, do you want to add something?
No, I don't think so. I think that's good.
Yeah, I think the other thing that yes, so, the periodicity of measurement is quite important, and we recognize very much that time and, the sort of time is a really important part of how well-being is experienced. And, is it going to suddenly increase and then drop off suddenly? And then what do you do when that happens? So that's something that we're aware of and thinking of. But as of now, that's our solution. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Shreya and Sarah. I think we have time just for one final question, and then we have to wrap up. And so there were a few questions in the Q&A box that were asking, obviously, since this is a HTCA associated webinar as well, about some of the main criticisms or also some of the main advantages that you would see in your approach compared to the capability approach. And so maybe that's a nice point for us to have a wrap here and summarize a little bit your thoughts on these two frameworks and how you see them complement or substitute one another, perhaps.
Always feels quite a challenge to talk about the capability approach, because it is so broad and there has been so much work on it and many people working on it in different ways. So to summarize it as though it's one thing seems to be quite a challenge. I think that we would see that there's a fundamental similarity between our approaches in that sort of person-centered emphasis, that it's about what people are able to have and do, what people people are able to do, what people are able to think and feel. So that kind of core, which we think is core to a well-being approach, actually, is that person-centeredness, would be similar to the capability approach. I think our theoretical reference points are fairly different. The capability approach obviously comes sort of more from economics and economic philosophy, whereas our approach is very much, we're drawing on a more sociological set of reference points. So that would give a difference. And I think, at least my understanding is, and I'm sure that there are people in the audience who could correct me, but my understanding is that capability approach ultimately does have an individualist kind of center, rather than an individualist ontology at its center rather than a relational one. So we would see that as a difference. But I'm also aware that there may be developments of the capability approach that have taken it in a more relational direction that I'm not aware of. So I think, the ancestors are different, and that makes a difference to the way that we see things.
Thanks, Sarah. Shreya, any additional remarks from you?
Yeah, no, I think that covers it.
All right, well then I think this brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you so much, Shreya and Sarah, for joining us today and for your presentation. Thank you to all participants for joining us, taking the time, whichever time zone you're in at the moment and wherever you are, and for all your questions. Those whose questions haven't been answered now, rest assured that we do have a copy of the Q&A section, and so the questions can nevertheless reach our presenters. Let me also just point out that we'll have 2 additional webinars in this series. Next, we'll have Karen Scott on multidimensional well-being measures as policy instruments on the 22nd of July. So please do join us again. And then further ahead, Sabina Alkaya on limitations and frontiers in concepts, measures, and applications of multidimensional well-being measurement. All further details, including how to register, can be found on our website, which we're going to post again here in the chat. And the recording of today's webinar will be available there very soon as well. So with that, thanks again, Sarah and Shreya. Thanks to all attendees, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.